The fire had been burning for 3 hours before Fannie Keller realized she was the last woman standing in Caldwell Creek, and the only reason she had not run was because her father's body was still inside the saloon. It was the summer of 1878, deep in the Kansas Territory, when the town of Caldwell Creek learned what it meant to be truly abandoned. The drought had come first, cracking the earth into broken plates of red clay that curled at the edges like burned paper. Then the railroad men had come through, looked at the dust and the dying cattle and the half-empty water barrels, and turned their surveying equipment 3 miles south toward Larrabee Flats, where there was still a river worth crossing. Without the promise of a rail line, the merchants had begun packing. The livery stable owner left in April. The doctor followed in May. By June, even Reverend Hollis had loaded his Bible and his wife into a wagon and headed north toward Dodge City, offering prayers over his shoulder as though God required a forwarding address. But the fire had finished it. It had started in the mill at the edge of town, just past noon on a Wednesday, when the heat was so fierce that the air itself seemed to lean against you. Someone had left a lantern too close to a pile of dry grain sacks, or perhaps a spark had drifted up from the blacksmith's forge. Nobody knew for certain, and in the end it did not matter. What mattered was that the wind was blowing from the south, and it carried the flames north, up through the dry timber frames of the buildings along Front Street, jumping from rooftop to rooftop with a terrifying ease, like a child skipping stones across a pond. People had screamed. Horses had bolted. Wagons had loaded and emptied and loaded again. Fannie had watched all of it from the doorway of the apothecary, where she worked mornings grinding herbs and filling small paper packets with medicines that no one in Caldwell Creek could afford anymore. She had watched the Hendersons throw their children into their buckboard and whip their horse into a run. She had watched the Malone brothers drag their mother between them, the old woman wailing something about her good china. She had watched the Dalton family, all 7 of them, disappear in a cloud of dust heading east, and she had felt a cold and hollow thing settle in her chest because she could not go. Her father, Thomas Keller, had been drinking since morning. He had been drinking since most mornings, if she was honest with herself, since her mother had passed 2 winters ago from a fever that the now-departed doctor had not been able to treat. Thomas Keller had once been a respected man, a furniture maker who crafted chairs and tables with a care that people came from 3 counties over to admire. Now he sat at the back table of the Red Horse Saloon and spent whatever little money Fannie earned on whiskey, and she could not hate him for it because she understood that grief was not always dignified. She had run to the saloon the moment she had smelled smoke. She had grabbed her father by the collar and pulled, and he had looked at her with those watery blue eyes that were so much like her own and said, with complete sincerity, "I am not done yet, Fannie girl." She had told him there was fire coming. He had nodded slowly, as though she had told him interesting news about the weather in another state, and then he had toppled sideways off his chair and hit his head against the corner of the bar with a sound she would never in her life forget. He was not dead, not then. He was unconscious, his chest still rising and falling, but he was too heavy for her to carry, and the fire was too close for her to find help. She had managed to drag him to the far corner of the saloon, the stone corner where the fireplace was built into the wall, and she had covered him with a wet horse blanket she had found behind the bar, and she had sat beside him with her hand on his chest and prayed with more sincerity than she had managed since she was a child. The fire had taken the mill, the dry goods store, the land office, and 3 houses before it reached Front Street proper. Then the wind had shifted. Just like that, as though God or fortune or pure random chance had decided to be kind for once, the wind had turned and blown back toward the creek bed, and the fire had found nothing there worth burning, and it had died down to a sullen red glow that smoldered and spat but did not advance. The saloon had survived. The apothecary had survived. The blacksmith's building, being mostly stone, had survived. Several of the structures on the eastern side of Front Street were only scorched rather than destroyed. But by the time the fire had settled into its smoldering remainder, Caldwell Creek had emptied of every living person except for Fannie Keller, who was sitting in the ashes of the town's eastern boardwalk, watching a thread of black smoke curl up into the flat Kansas sky, and Samuel Crawford, who she had not yet met. She heard his horse first. The sound of hooves on the burned planking of the main street was the only sound in the world at that moment besides the distant hiss and pop of dying embers, and it hit her like something physical, that sound. She stood up without thinking about it, her dress still streaked with ash and her hands still shaking from the hours of fear and helplessness, and she turned toward the sound. He came in from the north end of town, riding a bay horse that was nervous about the smell of smoke but obedient enough to keep moving forward despite it. He was a tall man even on horseback, broad through the shoulders, wearing a worn canvas jacket and a dark hat that had clearly been through weather. He was perhaps 30, she thought, though the sun had put years on his face that she would later learn it had not quite earned. He had dark eyes that moved quickly across the ruined street, taking in everything, the blackened frames of the burned buildings, the abandoned tools and household items that people had dropped in their haste, the single woman standing in the middle of the road with ash in her hair. He pulled up his horse 6 feet from her and looked at her steadily for a moment. "I saw the smoke from 10 miles out," he said. "I thought there would be nobody left." "There is almost nobody left," she said. He looked around the street again, and something in his expression shifted, something she could not quite name. Then he swung down from the saddle with practiced ease and stood holding his horse's reins, looking at her more carefully. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. And then, because she was tired and frightened and had been holding herself very still for a very long time, she said, "My father is hurt. He is inside the saloon. He fell and hit his head." Samuel Crawford tied his horse to the post that was still standing outside the saloon, one of the few posts still standing, and followed her inside without another word. Thomas Keller was still breathing when they reached him. Samuel knelt beside the old man and examined the wound on his head with careful hands, turning him gently, checking his breathing, pressing 2 fingers to the pulse at his throat. "He needs a doctor," Samuel said. "The doctor left in May," Fannie said. Samuel looked up at her then, and she saw in his face the realization of exactly how alone they were settling over him like dust. "I have some experience with wounds," he said. "I was a field medic for 3 years during the war." She did not ask which war. In 1878, there was only one war people meant when they said the war. She was 24 years old and she had been a child during it, but she had grown up in its shadow as everyone her age had. "What do you need?" she asked. "Clean water if there is any, cloth, whatever medicine you have." She was the apothecary's assistant. She had both. For the next 2 hours, she and Samuel Crawford worked together over her father's body, cleaning the wound and binding it, keeping him warm despite the heat because Samuel said something about shock, keeping his head elevated on a folded saddle blanket. Thomas Keller stirred twice, groaned once, and subsided again into unconsciousness. His breathing remained steady throughout, which Samuel said was a good sign. Fannie held her father's hand and watched Samuel work and thought about how strange it was that a complete stranger should be here in the ruins of her town, doing this thing for her, and she did not even know his name yet. "I am Fannie Keller," she said, when they had done everything they could for the moment. He looked up from where he was washing his hands in the basin she had brought. "Samuel Crawford," he said. "What brought you to Caldwell Creek, Mr. Crawford?" He dried his hands on a cloth and leaned against the bar, and he looked at her with those dark, considering eyes, and she had the sense that he was deciding how much to say. "I was heading through," he said. "I heard this was a town worth stopping in." "It was," she said. 3 months ago it was." He nodded slowly, looking around the interior of the saloon at the abandoned glasses still on the bar and the cards still spread on the table where her father had been playing solitaire. "Where did everyone go?" "East mostly. Some north to Dodge, some just away." She paused. "The railroad decided to go south. That was the end of it, really. The fire was just the ending of the end." "And you?" he asked. "Why did you stay?" She looked at her father's still form. "I could not carry him," she said simply. Samuel Crawford was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And now that he can be moved when he wakes, what will you do?" It was the question she had been asking herself for months, before the fire and the drought and all of it. What would she do with this life that had somehow become her responsibility to maintain? She was 24, and she had no husband and no prospects in a town that was disappearing and a father who was disappearing in a different way, and she had been holding all of it together with her 2 hands and her stubbornness for 2 years. "I do not know," she said honestly. He nodded as though this was a fair answer. Then he stood up from the bar and said, "I will go and check what is still standing, see what can be used." She watched him go, and she thought that he moved through the ruined town with a kind of purpose that she had not seen in anyone for a long time. Thomas Keller woke at dusk. He was confused and in pain, and it took Fannie a long time to explain to him what had happened, partly because he kept trying to sit up, and partly because he did not seem to fully believe her when she told him the town was mostly gone. She gave him water and a small amount of laudanum from her apothecary supplies, just enough to take the edge off the pain, and she sat with him while the light faded, and the sounds of the ruined street settled into an uneasy quiet. Samuel came back carrying 2 lanterns he had found in the livery stable, which was one of the structures still mostly intact. He set them on the bar and lit them, and the warm light did something for the interior of the saloon that darkness had not, made it feel almost habitable, almost like a place where people still lived. He had also, she discovered, found a side of cured ham that had been left in the smokehouse behind the general store, and a sack of dried beans, and a full barrel of water that someone had left when they fled. He made no ceremony about any of this. He simply set a fire in the saloon's small hearth and began cooking, and Fannie sat with her father and smelled the beans beginning to warm and thought that this was perhaps the strangest day of her life. They ate in near silence, the 3 of them, her father propped against the stone wall and managing half a bowl before he fell asleep again, and Fannie and Samuel at the bar with their bowls and the lanterns between them. "Where are you from originally?" she asked. "Missouri," he said. "A little place called Benton Springs. Not much different from this, I suppose. Do you have family there?" "Not anymore," he said. It was not a short answer exactly, but it was a complete one, and she understood without pressing him that there was a story there she was not going to hear tonight. "What were you doing before you were heading through?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought perhaps he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I was a cattle drover for 6 years, working the Kisham Trail. Before that, I was working a ranch in Texas. Before that, I was in the war." He paused. "I have been moving for a long time, moving towards something or away from something." She asked, and she was not sure why she asked it, because it was a bold question to put to a stranger, but the day had been so far beyond ordinary that bold questions seemed almost appropriate. He looked at her in the lamplight, and the corner of his mouth turned up very slightly. "I am not entirely sure," he said. "I have been asking myself that same question." She looked down at her bowl. "This town was supposed to be towards something," she said. "My father came here 12 years ago with every intention of building a good life, and he did for a while. He made beautiful furniture. People loved his work." She turned her bowl slowly in her hands. "Then my mother got sick, and then the railroad changed its plans, and then she stopped. Things come apart, I suppose, even things you build carefully." "They do," Samuel said, "but sometimes they can be put back together." She looked up at him. He was not looking at her with pity, which she appreciated very much. He was looking at her with a directness that she found both unsettling and oddly comfortable. "Are you planning to stay?" she asked. The question surprised them both, she thought. She had not planned to ask it, but there it was hanging in the air between them. "I think," he said slowly, "that I might be, for a while at least." She nodded, looking back at her bowl. "That is good," she said, in what she hoped was a neutral tone. "There is a lot to be done." The first week was a revelation in practicality. Fannie had never thought of herself as someone who noticed a man's hands particularly, but she found herself noticing Samuel Crawford's hands constantly, not in any scandalous way, but because they were always doing something and doing it well. He fixed the saloon's back door, which had been hanging crooked on its hinge since spring. He cleared the debris from the street in front of the apothecary. He repaired the water pump behind the livery stable, which was a feat she would not have known how to begin, and from which they had been drawing water with a bucket and a rope. He worked without drama, without complaint, without any of the self-congratulation that she had seen in men who did considerably less. Thomas Keller recovered slowly, and not entirely. The blow to his head had left him with headaches that laid him low for days at a time, and his balance was not what it had been, and Fannie thought privately that the drinking had not helped his recovery. But he was lucid again, more or less, and he sat in the saloon's front window and watched the work happening in the street with a complicated expression that she could not quite read. "Who is that man?" he asked her on the third morning. "Samuel Crawford," she said. "He came through the day of the fire." "Is he courting you?" She felt color rise in her face. "Papa, I have known him for 3 days." "I have seen men who were strangers 3 days ago and married a week later," Thomas said, with the absolute authority of someone who had once been full of life and had not entirely forgotten it. We are keeping the town going," she said. "What is left of it?" Said Thomas Keller, which was not agreement and was not disagreement, but was something that made her feel like she was 17 years old again. On the 4th day, a family came back. The Ibarra's Marcos and his wife Elena and their 2 sons, ages 14 and 11, drove their wagon back into Caldwell Creek at mid-morning with the subdued air of people who have tried an alternative and found it wanting. They had made it as far as Larrabee Flats, Elena told Fannie, only to find it no more promising than Caldwell Creek, and possibly less so, since at least Caldwell Creek was theirs. Samuel helped them unload their wagon and directed them to which buildings were sound and which were not, with an air of knowledge that Fannie found vaguely amusing, given that he had only been in town 4 days himself. "You speak like you own this place," she told him that evening, when the Ibarras had settled into their house on the north end of Front Street, which had survived the fire with only cosmetic damage. "I should not presume," he said, but he said it with that same slight curve at the corner of his mouth that she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile. "No," she said, "but it is good that someone does." He looked at her, and something passed between them that she was not ready to examine yet. She looked away first. On the 7th day, Samuel found her in the apothecary. She was inventorying what remained of the medicines, making a careful list of what would need to be ordered, though she had no idea how she would afford any of it or from whom she would order it, given that the nearest functioning supply line was in Dodge City. She heard his boots on the floorboards and looked up. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands, which was something she had not seen him do before. He always wore his hat, indoors or out. It was a small thing to notice, and yet she noticed it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down her pencil. "All right." "I did not just happen to be heading through Caldwell Creek," he said. "I knew about this town. I had heard about it from a man I met in Wichita back in the spring who said it was a town that still had possibilities if the railroad situation could be figured out. I came to see for myself." She waited. "I have some money saved," he said. 12 years of wages. "I have been looking for somewhere to put down roots, and I thought," he stopped, "started again. I think this town can be something again. The land here is good. The creek did not dry up entirely, which means there is water below the surface. The buildings that survived the fire are sound, and the railroad, the southern route through Larrabee Flats, is longer than the northern route. If someone were to make the case to the railroad company, if someone were to guarantee them certain things about land access and water availability," she stared at him. "You want to rebuild Caldwell Creek?" "I think it can be rebuilt," he said carefully. "I am not saying it would be easy or fast, but I have been looking for something worth rebuilding." She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at her steadily. "Because it is your town," he said. "Because your father built things here. Because you stayed when everyone else left, and I think that means something." He paused. "And because I would like to stay, and I think you should know my reasons for staying are honest ones." She thought about her father's question from 3 days ago. She thought about the way Samuel's hands were always doing something. She thought about the lanterns he had lit and the beans he had cooked, and the way he had knelt over her father's still form with such careful competence. "It is a large undertaking," she said. "It is," he agreed. "You might fail." "I might," he said. "Most things worth doing have that risk." She picked up her pencil. She looked at her inventory list. Then she said without looking up, "I know the names of the families who left. I know where most of them went. Some of them might come back if there was a reason." She heard him exhale, a slow and careful breath. "That would be useful information," he said. She looked up then, and they looked at each other across the cluttered shelves of the apothecary, and she thought that he was looking at her as though she was herself a kind of useful information. "I will help you," she said. "With the town, I mean." "I know what you mean," he said, and his voice was quieter than it had been, and she felt that quietness settle somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. The weeks that followed were the hardest work Fannie Keller had ever done, and she had been doing hard work since she was old enough to stand at a washtub. She wrote letters. She wrote dozens of letters to the families who had fled, to the railroad company's regional office in Topeka, to the territorial governor's office, to supply merchants in Dodge City and Wichita. She wrote in her clear, precise hand, making arguments with a thoroughness that surprised even herself, because she had not known until she started writing them how strongly she felt about the place. Samuel, meanwhile, built. He fixed roofs and patched walls and replaced windows with whatever materials he could salvage or purchase. He rode to Larrabee Flats twice to buy lumber, because the mill was gone and would need to be rebuilt. He hired 2 men he met in Larrabee Flats, a carpenter named Pete Gonzalez and an older man called Sutherland who had experience with stone masonry, and brought them back to Caldwell Creek with the promise of good wages and permanent positions. Marcos Ibarra turned out to be a skilled plumber, something he had apparently learned in a previous life in San Antonio, and he took on the project of repairing and extending the town's water system with an enthusiasm that suggested he had been waiting for a project worthy of him. Thomas Keller, who had good days and bad days in almost equal measure, spent his good days sitting on the Mendied front porch of the saloon and directing passers-by with unsolicited opinions about their work. On one of his very good days, he asked Samuel to bring him some wood from the lumber supply, and a week later, Fannie found him in the back room of the saloon with a half-finished chair leg in his hands, his face wearing an expression she had not seen on it in 2 years. She stood in the doorway and watched him work and cried very quietly where he could not see her. The first letter back from the railroad came in early September, 6 weeks after the fire. It was cautious and non-committal and written in the language of men who would not say yes but were considering not saying no. Samuel read it twice, then handed it to Fannie, who read it once and said, "They are interested." This is the language of people who are interested but want someone else to make the next move. "What is the next move?" he asked. "You need to go to Topeka," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That would mean leaving," he said. "For perhaps 2 weeks," she said. She was aware that this should not feel significant, that 2 weeks was not very long, and yet she noticed that it felt significant anyway. "You would be all right?" he asked. She straightened slightly. "I have been all right," she said, "through considerably worse." Something moved across his face. "You have," he said. He sounded like he meant it as a statement of high respect, and she received it as such. He left on a Monday morning, and she stood in front of the apothecary and watched him ride out through the north end of town, and she told herself very firmly that the hollow feeling in her chest was simply the practical concern of someone who relied on a colleague. She kept busy. There was always plenty to keep busy with. She organized the returning families. By the end of August, 4 more had come back, including the Hendersons, who had made it all the way to Ellsworth before turning around. into a proper community meeting, held in the saloon, where they drew up a list of priorities and divided the work. She managed the medical needs of the town in the absence of a doctor, which was not ideal but was what there was, and she sent letters to several medical institutions asking whether any young physicians might be interested in establishing a practice in a rebuilding frontier town with promising prospects. She wrote in her journal every night, which she had done since she was 12, and she noticed that Samuel Crawford appeared in the journal more frequently than anyone else. He came back on a Thursday, 16 days after he had left. She heard his horse on the street and looked up from the letter she was writing, and she did not move for a moment, just listened to the sound of his return, which was a strange thing to do because she had never before noticed what the sound of someone's return felt like. He came through the apothecary door with dust from the trail still on him and a light in his eyes that had not been there when he had left. "They said yes," he said. She set down her pen. "The northern route comes through Caldwell Creek," he said, "in exchange for guaranteed land access on the eastern side of the creek and a station house built to their specifications. They want to start surveying in the spring." He was smiling now, a full, unguarded smile that she had not seen on him before, and it changed his face entirely, made him look younger and less careful. "We are getting the railroad, Fannie." She stood up. She crossed the apothecary in 3 steps, and she was not entirely sure what she intended to do, but what she did was take both of his hands in hers, and he held her hands in return, and they stood like that in the middle of the apothecary for several long seconds while the news settled around them like something solid and real. "We did it," she said. "You wrote those letters," he said. "The railroad man in Topeka said your letter was the most clearly argued case he had received on behalf of any town in the territory." She laughed, a real laugh, startled and pleased. "I simply told them the truth." "That is rarer than it should be," he said. She was still holding his hands. She became aware of this at the same moment that he seemed to become aware of it, and they both looked down at their joined hands simultaneously, and then both looked up at the same moment and their eyes met at very close range. She stepped back. He let her hands go. "I should tell the others," she said. "Yes," he said. He was still smiling, but it was quieter now. "Yes, you should." That evening, the community meeting in the saloon was the loudest and most jubilant thing Caldwell Creek had seen in perhaps 2 years. Alina Ibra produced a bottle of wine she had been saving for a significant occasion, and Sutherland, the stonemason, turned out to play a fiddle with great energy if not great precision, and even Thomas Keller was present, seated in a chair that he had finished building that week, which was perhaps the most significant thing of all. Fannie sat at the end of the bar and watched the room and felt something unlocking in her chest that she had not realized was locked. She caught Samuel's eye across the room, and he raised his glass slightly in her direction, and she raised hers back. Later, when the party had wound down and the room had mostly emptied and her father had been helped back to the room upstairs where he slept, she and Samuel sat at the bar in the lamplight as they had on that very first night, and it felt familiar now in a way that surprised her, given that it had only been 7 weeks. "Do you remember the night after the fire?" she asked. "I remember every night since then," he said. She turned her glass slowly in her hands, the same habit she had with bowls and cups when she was thinking. "You asked me what I would do," she said. "When my father could be moved. I did. I did not know the answer then," she said. "What is the answer now?" he asked. She looked up at him. "Stay," she said. "Rebuild, make something worth making." She paused. "Is that enough of an answer?" He looked at her with those dark eyes that she had been looking into for 7 weeks and learning new things about every time. "That is everything," he said quietly. "That is exactly everything." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. Outside, the Kansas night was immense and star-filled in the way that only prairie nights could be, where the sky went from one edge of the world to the other with nothing to interrupt it. The embers in the saloon's hearth were low and orange. "I should tell you something," Samuel said. She waited. I have not been easy to know for most of my life," he said. He was speaking carefully, choosing words with the precision of a man who did not say things carelessly but also found certain things hard to say. I lost my family in the war, my mother and my 2 brothers. My father had already gone before that. He stopped. I have been alone for a long time. By choice, I think, though I told myself it was circumstance. She looked at him steadily. I understand that, she said. Grief makes us choose things and call them accidents. He looked at her sharply, as though she had said something that struck closer than expected. When I came to Caldwell Creek, he said, I told you I had heard it had possibilities. That was true. But I had heard about other towns too, and I had not gone to those. He paused. I heard in Wichita about a woman who ran the apothecary in Caldwell Creek and who had kept the town going almost single-handed for a year. The man who told me was a traveling merchant who had sold her supplies. He looked at his glass. He said she was the most capable person he had met in 3 years of traveling this territory, and that she was doing it alone. Fannie was very still. I'm not saying I came here because of you, he said. I am saying I think I was looking for proof that something was worth stopping for, and the story of you was that proof. She breathed slowly. That is a very complicated thing to say, she told him. It is a true thing, he said. I thought you should know it. She looked at the bar, at the old scarred wood of it, at the rings left by 10,000 glasses. She thought about everything she had done in the past year, all of it performed in the faith that it was worth doing even when she could not see the point. She thought about her father's hands on a chair leg. She thought about the letters she had written in her precise hand to people who might not write back. I am glad you stayed, she said finally. I am glad you were the only other person who stayed. When she looked up at him, he was looking at her with an openness that she had not seen before, all the careful, guarded quality gone from his face, and she thought she was seeing what he actually looked like when he was not protecting himself from anything. Fannie, he said. Yes, she said. And that was enough for that night. It was enough to sit in the lamplight of the rebuilt saloon with the stars enormous outside the window and know that both of them were staying. The months that followed were ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. The ordinary part was the work, which was constant and demanding and occasionally maddening. The surveying crew arrived from Topeka in March of 1879. 4 men with instruments and notebooks who walked every inch of the land along the north side of the creek and marked stakes into the ground, and argued among themselves about angles in a jargon that meant nothing to Fannie, but apparently meant a great deal to Samuel, who spent 2 days walking the survey with them and coming home. She had begun thinking of wherever he was as coming home, which she noted but did not examine too closely, with dirt on his boots and a satisfied expression. Pete Gonzalez built the station house. It took 3 months and was a source of considerable local pride when it was done. It was a solid, square building with a proper ticket window and a waiting room with benches that Samuel had commissioned from Thomas Keller, who was now spending most of his waking hours in his workshop and had stopped spending them at the bar, a development that Fannie attributed to a combination of the headache medication she had been managing carefully, the purposeful work, and whatever conversations he and Samuel had been having on the front porch of an evening that she was not privy to. More families came back through the winter and spring. Some came back to find their houses gone and moved into other structures, and that created some disputes about property that Fannie and Samuel and Marcos Ibarra sorted out with varying degrees of diplomacy and firmness. A young man from Wichita named Arthur Briggs arrived in February with a letter of introduction from a medical school in St. Louis, and the intention of establishing a practice, and Fannie gave him the apothecary space and introduced him to everyone, and felt a complex mixture of relief and loss, because she had been managing the town's medical needs for months, and she was not entirely sure who she was without that particular responsibility. You will find other things, Samuel told her, with the confidence of someone who had watched her work. I have no shortage of things to do, she agreed. That is not what I mean, he said. She looked at him. He looked back. This was a mode of communication they had developed, Fannie and Samuel, a way of saying things through the space between words that was sometimes more efficient than the words themselves. There was a night in April that she thought about afterward for a long time, because it was the night things shifted between them past the point of pretending they had not. It had rained for 3 days, a proper spring rain that turned the street to mud and kept most people indoors, and the two of them had been working at the table in the back room of the saloon. It had become an unofficial office of sorts for the rebuilding project, with papers and ledgers spread between them, and a lamp burning against the gray afternoon light. They had been talking about the supply arrangements for the railroad station when a crack of thunder came that was so close and so sudden that Fannie started and knocked her ink bottle sideways and grabbed for it, and so did Samuel, and their hands collided on the neck of the bottle, and neither of them let go. Thunder rolled away into the distance. The rain hammered the roof. They were both holding the ink bottle. His hand was over hers. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke, and then she turned her hand over beneath his so their palms were together, and he held it, just held her hand on the table in the lamplight with the rain coming down. "I think," Samuel said, in a voice that was very careful, "that I have been wanting to say something to you for a considerable amount of time." "I think," Fannie said, "that I have been wanting you to say it." He was quiet for a moment. She felt his thumb move slowly across the back of her hand. "I love you," he said. "I think I have loved you for most of the time I have been in this town, which I recognize is perhaps a bold thing to say." She looked at their joined hands. She looked at him. She thought about 7 weeks becoming 7 months, about lanterns and letters and riding out at dawn and returning at dusk, about her father's face on a good day, about the railroad stakes in the earth along the north side of the creek, about all of it built and building. "It is not bold," she said. "It is true. And I love you too, Samuel Crawford, which I will tell you plainly because I have never seen the sense in making someone guess." He smiled then, the full unguarded smile she had first seen in the apothecary when he came back from Topeka. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that she felt the breath leave her body. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "but properly, not here over ink ledgers." She laughed, because his expression was utterly sincere and also slightly abashed. "All right," she said. He asked her 2 days later on a Sunday morning in the rebuilt apothecary, which was where she had first told him she would help him with the town. He had obviously put thought into the location, which touched her deeply. He was holding his hat in his hands again, the way he had on the first day he came to tell her his real reasons for staying, and she thought that the hat in hands was his tell, the thing he did when something mattered enough to be nervous about. He asked her to marry him. He said it in straightforward language without flourishes, which was exactly how she would have wanted it said, and he told her that he wanted to build a life in Caldwell Creek with her, and that he understood what her father needed and was prepared to be part of that, and that he was not a man of many words, but he intended to be a man of many actions in her service for as long as she would have him. She said yes before he finished the sentence. There was a wonderful, slightly chaotic moment where he was still talking, and she was saying yes, and he stopped talking and said, "Yes." And she said, "Yes." And then he put his hat on the shelf beside the dried chamomile and took her face in his hands and kissed her, slow and certain, like a man who had waited long enough. Thomas Keller, when told, shook Samuel's hand with a firmness that suggested he had been waiting for this even longer than Samuel had. Elena Ibarra cried with a wholehearted enthusiasm that Fannie found enormously touching. Marcos Ibarra slapped Samuel on the back and said something in Spanish that Fannie did not entirely follow, but that made Samuel laugh. They were married in June of 1879, in the open space on the east side of Front Street, where the old land office had stood before the fire. It was not a church, because there was no church yet. They had been discussing building one, and now it moved up considerably on the priority list. But Reverend Hollies had been one of the people who came back, having found Dodge City no more to his taste than Caldwell Creek had been at its worst, and he performed the ceremony with great sincerity and considerably more emotion than Fannie had expected from a man she had previously found rather dry. Thomas Keller walked her down the improvised aisle between the two rows of chairs. He walked slowly, because his balance was still not entirely what it had been, but he walked upright and with dignity, and he held her arm with steady hands, and when he placed her hand in Samuel's he said, in a low voice that only the three of them could hear, "Take care of each other." "We will," Samuel said. The first railroad train arrived in Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday in October of 1879. The town had grown to 47 people by then, which was not the largest it had ever been but was considerably more than zero, which is where it had briefly been. The station house looked solid and purposeful in the October sunlight. Samuel had arranged for the supply merchant from Wichita, the same one who had told him about Fannie all those months ago, to be on the first train, which struck Fannie as both sentimental and practically useful, since they needed new inventory in the apothecary badly. The merchant, a round-faced man named Hutchins who wore a very clean hat, shook her hand vigorously and said, "Mrs. Crawford, I hear that you too are the reason this town is standing." "We are the reason," Fannie said, "but we had a great deal of help." She glanced at Samuel, who was standing nearby talking to the railroad station master, and he glanced back as though he had felt her looking. "You are a formidable woman," Hutchins said, with genuine admiration. "I simply stayed when leaving seemed easier," she said. "Sometimes," Hutchins said, "that is the most formidable thing there is." She thought about that for a long time after, in the weeks and months that followed, as the town continued to build itself back up around her. She thought about what it had meant to stay, and what the staying had led to, and how strange and unpredictable the chain of events was that connected one person's stubbornness to another person's arrival to a whole town's second chance. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was cold and long, as Kansas winters always were, but the town had laid in good supplies through the fall, and the railroad was running, and there was firewood stacked behind every house, and a real sense of permanence that had not existed before. Samuel bought the land on the east side of the creek that had been part of the railroad negotiation, and began planning a proper farm, which was something he had talked about wanting since their early conversations in the apothecary. Fannie continued to run the apothecary alongside Dr. Briggs, who was still young enough to be learning more than he was teaching, and she found that she genuinely loved the work in a way that had not changed even now, that it was no longer born of necessity but of genuine vocation. She ordered new medicines through the railroad supply line. She corresponded with a woman in Philadelphia who was one of the very few women trained in pharmacy in the country, and who sent her papers and advice, and once, a simply extraordinary collection of herbal remedies from European tradition that Fannie spent 2 entire winter evenings reading with complete absorption. Samuel, watching her read by the firelight with that focused attention of hers that he had come to love almost above all her other qualities, said, "You should have gone to school." "There was no school to go to," she said without looking up. "Women were not particularly invited." "That is an injustice," he said. She did look up then because he said it with such simple directness. "Yes," she said, "it is." "Things are changing," he said. "Not fast enough." "No," she agreed, "not fast enough." "But they are changing." She looked at him steadily. "I do not intend to wait for them to finish changing before I do what I am going to do." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that look of his that she had come to understand meant he was feeling something he did not quite have words for, something large and certain. "No," he said softly, "you would not." She returned to her reading, and he returned to the ledger he had been working on, and the fire burned and the wind came down off the Kansas plain and moved around the walls of their house, and inside it was warm and lit and full of the particular quiet of two people who are entirely comfortable with each other. In February of 1880, Fannie told Samuel she was expecting a child. He was so still for a moment that she thought she had somehow managed to tell him badly, but then she saw his face and understood that he was simply overwhelmed, and she watched him work through it, the surprise and the joy and the underpinning of fear that anyone who has lost people feels when they are offered something new to lose. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am," he stopped. "Yes, yes, I am better than all right." He came around the table and took her hands, the way he had done so many times now in the rain and the lamplight and the bright days of ordinary life. "Are you all right?" "I am wonderful," she said, and she was. Thomas Keller received the news with a slowness that suggested he was receiving it from a great distance and bringing it close, which was sometimes how he was now. But when it had fully arrived, he reached out and held Fanny's face in his large, work-roughened hands and looked at her with eyes that were entirely clear. "Your mother would be so proud," he said. "I know," she said. "I am so proud," he said. She covered his hands with hers. "I know that too, Papa." The baby was born in October of 1880, a boy delivered by Dr. Briggs with Fanny's close and somewhat supervisory attention throughout the process, which Briggs later said was the most educational birth he had attended from a purely informational standpoint. Samuel was downstairs in the new house they had built on the south end of Front Street, the house that was larger and more solid than anything else in Caldwell Creek, built from proper lumber and with a stone foundation, and he paced the kitchen for 6 hours in a state of contained anxiety that Marcos Ibarra, who had come to keep him company, said later had worn a visible track in the floorboards. When Briggs came downstairs to tell him he had a son, Samuel sat down suddenly in the nearest chair, as though his legs had simply stopped working, and stayed there for a moment with his hands on his knees. "A son," he said. "Healthy," Briggs said, "and Mrs. Crawford is doing very well." Samuel got up and went upstairs, and he sat beside Fanny on the bed and looked at the boy she was holding, this small, red-faced, serious person who was somehow their accomplishment together. And he put his finger against the baby's hand and felt the tiny grip close around it with a strength that was disproportionate to the size of the thing. And he said, "Fanny," in a voice that was not entirely steady. "I know," she said softly. They named him Thomas for her father. Thomas Keller Crawford, which was a substantial name for such a small person, but Samuel said it would grow into, and it did. Thomas Keller, the elder, who had been having more good days than bad since the birth of his grandson, spent every possible moment in proximity to the baby, which was sometimes a great help and sometimes complicated the practicalities of daily life considerably. He had finished 6 chairs and a table since September, and Pete Gonzalez had sold them on his behalf through his contacts in Dodge City, and the money was more than Thomas Keller had earned in 2 years before the fire. On one of these afternoons, when Thomas was watching the baby sleep in his cradle with the focused attention of someone assigned a very important task, Samuel sat beside him, and they talked for a long time about things that Samuel had never talked about with anyone. About Missouri, about his brothers, about the war, about the years after, when he had moved from place to place as though forward motion could substitute for having somewhere to be. Thomas Keller, who had his own experience with loss and its distortions, listened with the patience of a man who understood what it cost to speak plainly about grief. "You found the right place," Thomas said, when Samuel was done. "I found the right person," Samuel said. "The place came with her." Thomas smiled at that, a slow, real smile. "She was always like that," he said. "Even as a child, people and places gathered around her. She had that quality of making things worth being near." Samuel looked at the baby, who had woken and was regarding the ceiling with an expression of profound philosophical consideration. "She still has it," he said. Caldwell Creek in 1880. One was a different place from Caldwell Creek in 1878, by virtually every measure. The railroad brought regular trade and regular people. A new general store had opened, and a proper hotel, and the church that Reverend Hollis had wanted for so long was finally built. A white-painted wooden structure on the north end of Front Street that was not large but was genuinely handsome, with a bell that could be heard across the creek on still mornings. A school opened in the fall of 1881, which was one of the things Fannie had been working toward since before the railroad, and which she had not been able to accomplish until the town had children enough to fill it and money enough to pay a teacher. The teacher was a woman named Miss Pearl Adkins, 26 years old and freshly arrived from Ohio, where she had attended a normal school and earned a certificate in primary education, and she was so clearly the right person for the job that Fannie felt the particular satisfaction of watching something work exactly as she had imagined it would. She told Samuel about it that evening, when the baby was asleep and the house was quiet. "She is exactly right," she said. "She is patient and she is interesting. The children will love her." "Will the children's parents love her?" Samuel asked. "Some will have doubts," Fannie said, "because she is a woman and unmarried and educated, which some people consider a suspicious combination." "Some people," Samuel said, "are wrong about most things." She looked at him. "You have become very direct in your old age," she said. He was 33. She was 27. "My old age," he repeated with a tone of mild protest. She laughed, and he caught the sound of it and held it in his eyes. He did that still, after all this time, caught the moments of her happiness and held them with a concentration that she found, even after 2 years of marriage, startling in the best way. He had built the farm on the east side of the creek, as he had planned, and it was producing wheat mostly and some corn, and a kitchen garden that was Fannie's domain, and which she managed with the same organizational exactness she applied to everything. They had 6 horses and a milk cow and more chickens than either of them could easily count. It was not a large operation, but it was a real one, and it was theirs in a way that felt fundamental, built from the ground up with their own hands and their own choices. There were hard things, too, because there were always hard things, and the story of Fannie and Samuel Crawford was not exempt from the general conditions of human life. Thomas Keller had a very bad spell in the winter of 1881, 3 weeks where he barely left his bed and the headaches were savage and constant, and Fannie spent those 3 weeks in a state of controlled, working fear that she recognized from the day of the fire. But he came through it, and on the other side of it he was thinner and slower, but still himself, still the man who made chairs and sat on the porch in the mornings and held his grandson with careful hands. There was a dispute with a rancher named Colton who owned land to the west of the creek, and who had decided that the expansion of Caldwell Creek represented a threat to his grazing range. Colton was not a violent man, but he was a stubborn and litigious one, and the dispute over water rights and boundary lines kept Samuel occupied for 6 months and kept Fannie writing letters again, this time to a land rights attorney in Topeka who had been recommended by the railroad's legal office. The matter was eventually settled in the town's favor through a combination of careful legal argument and a negotiated compensation arrangement that left Colton unhappy, but not aggrieved enough to cause further trouble. "You always know what words to use," Samuel told her, reading her final letter in the dispute with the expression of someone reading something they wish they had written. "You always know what work to do," she said. "We are a reasonable combination." "A reasonable combination," he repeated, with something that might have been amusement at the understatement. In the spring of 1882, Fannie discovered she was expecting again. This pregnancy was different from the first. She was more tired, more certain in some ways and less in others, and she had an instinct, which she did not share for some weeks, that this time it was a girl. She was right. Eleanor Me Crawford was born in November of 1882, a winter baby with a surprising amount of dark hair and her father's eyes, delivered by Dr. Briggs with considerably less supervision from Fannie this time, because Fannie had decided somewhere in the proceedings that she trusted Briggs and she was going to rest. She told Samuel this afterward as a point of personal growth, and he looked at her with such fond incredulity that she had to laugh even through the exhaustion. Young Thomas, 2 years old and fully ambulatory, had definite opinions about the new baby that evolved over several weeks from suspicion to guardianship. By Christmas, he was bringing Alina things, toys, spoons, interesting stones with the solemn purposefulness of an ambassador. Thomas Keller Sr. held Alina for the first time and said, very quietly, "She looks like her grandmother, around the eyes." Fannie leaned against his shoulder and they both looked at the baby together, and she felt the presence of her mother in the room with them, soft and certain, the way the dead are sometimes present when you love them enough to keep them. "She does," Fannie said. Samuel, who was standing nearby pretending to examine a shelf in order to give them privacy, heard this and looked at his wife's profile against the winter afternoon light from the window, and felt something so large and so particular that he had no word for it in any language he knew, though the closest English had was perhaps simply love. Caldwell Creek held its first proper civic election in March of 1883. It was not a complicated affair. There were perhaps 80 people in the town by then, which made governance more a matter of common sense than politics. But it was a real election with a ballot box and a count, and it chose a mayor and a town council of 5 people. Samuel Crawford was elected mayor by a substantial margin. He accepted with a brevity of speech that reflected both genuine humility and genuine relief that the speech part was over. Fannie was elected to the town council, which was, she was aware, unusual. She was one of the very few women in the territory to hold any elected position, and she accepted with a length of speech considerably greater than her husband's, because she had a great deal to say about what the council should prioritize, and it seemed efficient to say it immediately. Alina Ibarra was also elected to the council, and the two of them together accounted for a remarkable proportion of the council's eventual decisions over the next 3 years, a fact that some of the male residents found surprising, and others found entirely appropriate given what both women had done for the town. The school flourished under Miss Pearl Adkins, who turned out to have a gift not only for teaching, but for the larger project of building a community of learning. She organized a lending library from donated books, which was modest but real. She taught evening classes for adults who had never had proper schooling, which drew more people than anyone had expected, including, to Fannie's deep satisfaction, several of the men who had most loudly questioned whether a woman ought to be running a school. Thomas Keller attended one of these adult classes, not because he could not read, he could, very well, but because he said the evenings were good for him, and he liked the company. He sat in the back of the schoolroom with 3 men 30 years younger than him, and learned the things Miss Adkins was teaching, and seemed happier for it. On a Sunday afternoon in June of 1883, when the prairie was green from the spring rains, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a Kansas summer beginning, Fannie and Samuel walked out along the north bank of the creek while the children were with Thomas Keller. They walked slowly, the way they did when there was no particular hurry and both of them wanted the time. The creek was running well, better than it had in years, and the sound of it was good, the perpetual conversation of moving water. They reached the place where Samuel had driven the first survey stake, 5 years ago almost to the month, and stood looking at the town from the outside, from the north, the way Samuel had first seen it when he rode in on that smoky day. It looked different now, substantially different. There were more buildings and they were in better repair, and there was the white spire of the church visible above the roofline and the solid bulk of the station house and the school. There was smoke from a dozen chimneys even in June, because people were cooking and living and working in that cluster of buildings that had once been nearly entirely ash. "Do you remember riding in?" Fannie asked. "I remember," he said. "I remember you standing in the road with ash in your hair." "What did you think?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, considering the honest answer. "I thought you were the most striking person I had ever seen," he said. "And then I thought your father needed urgent attention." He paused, And then later I thought that I had been right to come here, that whatever I had been looking for, it was here. Was it? She asked. He looked at her, standing beside him in the June light with the creek sound behind them and the rebuilt town in front of them, and he said, "You are the most capable, the most determined, and the most genuinely kind person I have met in my entire life. You stayed when it was easier to go. You rebuilt when it was easier to leave. You made this place something worth coming back to." He paused. "You are everything I was looking for, Fannie Crawford. You are everything." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come riding in from the north through the smoke and stayed, who had held her father's still head in careful hands and lit lamps in the dark saloon and written to railroad companies and walked survey lines and built a farm and a house and a life, who said things when he had things to say and was silent when silence was correct, who held the moments of her happiness in his eyes. "I love you," she said. "I will love you for the rest of my life, Samuel Crawford." He put his arm around her shoulders and drew her against his side, and they stood together looking at the town they had built from the ashes of a lost one, and the creek ran past them, and the June sky above the Kansas plain was vast and full of light. It was not the end of their story, because stories do not end while people still live them. There would be more years, more work, more arguments about water rights and school funding and the proper way to negotiate with supply merchants. There would be another child, a boy they named James after Samuel's eldest brother who had died in the war, and who arrived in 1885 with a full head of red hair that neither parent could account for, and which delighted Thomas Keller completely. There would be good harvests and one terrible one. There would be the day that Thomas Keller finally could not get out of bed, and the week of sitting beside him, and the gentle morning in October when he passed without struggle or pain, with Fanny's hand in his and Samuel at the window, so that someone was watching the world on his behalf. There would be Thomas Jr. growing into a tall, quiet boy who had his grandfather's hands and his mother's precision. There would be Alina developing opinions about everything at an age when opinions seemed barely appropriate. Opinions she argued with a coherence that made even her father occasionally have to concede the point. There would be James, whose red hair defied explanation and whose energy defied containment, and who was found on 3 separate occasions in locations of the town where no 5-year-old had any business being. There would be the day that the town voted to name the street alongside the creek Crawford Street, which made Samuel profoundly uncomfortable and Fanny quietly pleased, and which Thomas Jr. told his schoolmates about in the exact tone of someone who considered the matter settled. There would be letters from the pharmaceutical woman in Philadelphia, whose name was Dr. Margaret Hartley, and who eventually sent Fanny a formal acknowledgment of her work in frontier medicine that Fanny framed and put on the wall of the apothecary, not from vanity, but because it represented something she believed in about women and what they were capable of and what they ought to be allowed to do. There would be the evening, many years later, when Fanny and Samuel sat on the porch of their house on the south end of Front Street, the house that was now completely familiar, worn smooth by the years of living in it, and watched the sun go down over the Kansas plain. The children were grown and in their own lives by then, mostly, though Alina still lived in town and still had definite opinions about everything. The railroad ran through Caldwell Creek 3 times a day. The school was a proper school with 2 teachers and a small library. The church had been enlarged twice. The apothecary was still the apothecary, still run by Fanny, though she had a young assistant now who was learning the work with the same focused attention that Fanny had once given to her own learning. They sat on the porch in the late light, Fanny and Samuel, and the evening was warm and the sound of the town going about its ordinary evening business was all around them. Voices, horses, the distant clang of something being repaired in Pete Gonzalez's workshop. And Samuel reached over and took Fanny's hand, the way he had done so many times and in so many circumstances over the course of their life together, and held it without saying anything. She turned her hand over beneath his so their palms were together. The same gesture as the first time, in the lamplight of the back room with the rain hammering the roof, the gesture that had been the beginning of everything said aloud. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered this honestly, as she considered everything. She thought about the fire and the ash and the hollow town and the man riding in from the north. She thought about letters written in the small hours and ledgers and railroad negotiations, and her father's hands on a chair leg. She thought about the children she had carried and the children she had raised and the work she had done that mattered and the love that had been the ground of all of it. "I am," she said, "completely and entirely. Are you?" He looked at her, Samuel Crawford, who had been moving from place to place for 12 years and had stopped in a burning town because a woman had not left it, who had found in that stopping the thing he had not known he was looking for but had been looking for all his life. "I am," he said. "I found what I came here for. The railroad negotiation," she said with perfect innocence. "Yes," he said gravely, "the railroad negotiation, it was very satisfying." She laughed, and he held the sound of it the way he always had, and the evening settled golden around them, and the town of Caldwell Creek went about its business, built on the ashes of what had burned and the stubbornness of what had refused to leave, and alive in the particular way that only a built thing can be alive, not by accident but by decision, not by chance but by choice, and by the staying of one woman and one man in the ruins of something that had been worth rebuilding into something entirely new.